Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. So do I need to do a call to order? Do I have a motion to call this meeting?
No
Do
motion,
I?
just
No
call it to
motion.
order.
I'm just calling it to order. Glad you're here. Now we're going to do a roll call.
All right, and as I get started with the roll call, I'm just going to make a reminder for folks who have joined us before and an announcement for those who haven't. We do record these meetings so that minutes can be taken. So if you make comment during the sections on the agenda where that's appropriate, definitely use the microphone. You can turn it on to speak with the little person with the sound waves coming out of their mouth, and that ensures that it picks up on the audio. Now for the roll call, Joy Andrade. Councilmember Amy Beasley.
Yes, sir.
Amanda Bryant. Bruce Davis.
Here.
Diane Fleet.
Here.
TC Johnson is excused. Billy Love. Chris Primo.
Here.
David Shadd.
Here.
Councilmember Liz Sheehan is excused. And Lella Stowe.
Here.
So you all received in the packet, if you could take a minute and look at the minutes from the March 12th meeting. I'll give you a little time and then we'll take a motion to approve those minutes or make any changes. I see people studiously looking. Are you doing that to look smart or do you need some time? Do I have a motion to approve?
I'll make a motion to approve.
All right. Does anybody would like to second that?
Second.
Okay, so we have two. Wonderful. Let's make a vote. All those in favor of accepting the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Any abstentions? Any nays? The minutes are accepted.
All right, and now we will have public and partner comment for issues on the agenda.
Hearing nothing? Nothing?
Hearing nothing.
Hearing nothing. We're going to move along. Next, we will hear from the Data and Systems Integration Committee report with Joy Andrade.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I will go over our minutes a little bit. So we met on April 2nd at the John Ball campus at 1:30. The first item of business was to approve December 4th meeting minutes because we did not have a meeting earlier in 2025. The first item on the list was, it was noted that at the time of the meeting, there had not been any communication from HUD, specifically in regard to the point in time count in the housing inventory count. That was as of April 2nd. So I do believe we now have a date specifically for the submission of that data, which is June 13th. And it was noted that the reason for this delay was due to changes in gender kind of questioning and how that is outlined in that data. And then the next thing we did talk about was Jeff brought up specifically regarding data standards. We covered quite a bit and discussed in length some of the possibility of changes due to the current administration and specifically in regards to the HMIS forms. So if you notice any, disappearances of forms or things of that nature, important to note and bring attention to, but that may be as a result of our current administration. The next thing was Marissa covered some preliminary winter weather shelter data, which I do think some of this stuff we may cover in more length, but I will hit some highlights. So It looked like the majority of our folks were from age 35 to 60 range. 63.2% of attendees were white Caucasian and 30.4% being Black African American or African. It was also noted that the average length of time within the program who stayed in the program was 95 days and that the leavers average was 55 days. And then the next topic of discussion was Marissa and Jeff covered the housing triage system updates. And that local tool had been piloted with some local servers or providers in our area. And they did take some of the feedback and possibly improve some of the wording, and felt like it overall reflected more accurately it represented the housing needs for the community. And also that tool will be hopefully rolled out around July 1st. All right. Okay. And then Marissa did a by name list report. And then lastly, Adam covered the HMIS training updates. So the last new user training session was April 10th. And then the most recent end user group training took place on May 13th. And then our next meeting will be June 4th at 1:30 at the Don Ball campus. And we also had no items to approve in this meeting. So thank you.
Does anybody have any questions for Joy or any comments regarding her committee report? All right, thank you. So we will move on to Program Performance and Evaluation Committee, and instead of Councilperson Sheehan, I believe Melissa.
Yes, thank you. So Liz prepared a wonderful report for us. I will read it. We met on April 16th at 1:30 at the Don Ball Campus Center for the Program Performance and Evaluation Committee. Our first action was the unanimous approval of the meeting minutes from February 17th. This was followed by 4 program reviews, the first of which was with Community Action Council, their Crisis and Housing Support for Youth for those 18 to 24 years old, which is in a partnership with Arbor Youth Services. The discussion included a turnover in service providers, additional work that they would like to do with participants on crisis planning, and their community needs assessment. The next presentation, again from Community Action Council, was Project Independence Rapid Rehousing. Discussion included their exits to permanent housing and barriers to exits. This includes credit history, income, and past evictions. The third presentation was Greenhouse 17, Emergency Shelter for DV. Discussions included their work with partner agencies on raising cash income for clients, their therapeutics environment, and Jeff mentioned that they could apply for an ESR grant to help support the stipends, to help pay folks for work, to help get them financially stable. And the final presentation was with New Vista for their permanent supportive housing program. Discussion included whether that they would receive their renewal agreement for their funds from HUD and the success that they've had with IPS Support Employment Services. The next meeting will occur on June 18th at 1:30 at the Don Ball Campus Center located at 298 West Loudon Avenue. And those that will be presenting, it's going to be Bluegrass Care Navigators, their medical respite emergency shelter, Independence Place for their intensive case management, Lexington Fayette Urban County Government for the CSC Planning Grant, and the Lexington Housing Authority for their Landlord Partnership Program.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions for Marissa or any comments on the committee report? No? All right, thank you so much. So moving along, we're going to do Advocacy Issues and Programs Committee report with David Shad.
All right, the advocacy group met on February 26th at the Ball Center. First on the agenda, we had a presentation from New Creation House. Pastor Jesse Morris and Stephanie Morris presented on the New Creation House, which is transitional housing program. So they talked about trying to provide affordable housing. Right now they have 6 beds total for men. They have housing includes supportive services, mentorship, and requires 30 days drug and alcohol free. And they're looking to expand to provide housing for women as their next project. TC Johnson gave an update on the McKinney-Vento program. She reported 1,067 students currently on the McKinney-Vento list, 588 in elementary school, 218 in middle school, and 53 unaccompanied. I don't think that math adds up, but that's okay. That's what I have. And they're working with Partners for Youth Summer Training Program to provide some work opportunities. And Hands Up for Housing has provided over 100 referrals for families. They're also partnering with Goodwill to help clients with employment to qualify for housing assistance. And TC announced that her position as program manager will end June 30th as federal grant funding was not renewed. And Teresa Reynolds gave a presentation on the home plan revisions. The plan must now include all qualifying populations beyond just homeless individuals, and that includes people who are at risk of homelessness, domestic violence survivors, trafficking survivors. And it will still prioritize homeless individuals unsheltered first, and then those in emergency shelters. So that the current projects include, I think 3 properties, one on MLK, New Beginnings, and Davis Park and Pemberton. Maybe I missed one. All right, and Marissa talked about the lived experience engagement. She reported on the recent meeting, and the next meeting is planned to be in July to discuss the shelter study findings, which the shelter study is in progress and expected to be presented to council as early as June. Let's see. And the 2025-26 program standards calendar was approved with a correction to for November date to be changed to the 19th because of the holidays. So we do need a vote on that. And also, Jeff gave an update on the Housing Flex Fund. Community Action Council and Arbor Youth were selected to administer that fund, and it will provide financial assistance that is more flexible beyond some of the things that our traditional grants make available. It will help with things like eviction prevention, security deposits, transportation, employment equipment, and let's see. And I believe that is it.
Just one note that I'm going to add to this is that we now have a date scheduled for the shelter study to go to council. That's going to take place at the June 3rd work session at 3 p.m. at the Government Center, which is 200 East Main Street in the council chambers on the 2nd floor. We would definitely invite our partners to attend. To hear that presentation, but also to sign up for public comment if they want to share with the council their thoughts on the need for additional shelter resources. And we will have an item, as David mentioned, the 2025 Program Standards Review Calendar was approved by committee, so that would be the motion. We would need a second from the board.
I'll second.
All right, thank you, Diane. Is there any discussion of that before we take a vote?
Jeff, what time is that council meeting?
The work session will be at 3 p.m.
Okay. And you said we would sign up if we wanted to make a comment, there's a way to sign up for that?
Yeah, so when you would come upstairs to the council chambers, you would be able to sign up before you enter the room. They should have some staff out there assisting people with that process, but everybody is able to sign up. I believe it's 3 minutes of time that you can get. You can also yield your time to another individual if you'd like someone to have a little bit longer. There's no further discussion of the review calendar. We'll go ahead and take a vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes. All right. I'm going to be on the next several items, and I apologize. We're going to have some dense material today. We are going to have some visuals along the way to help break it up. We're going to first start with the encampment SOP and review report that was included in the meeting packet. So we have several locations that have been cleared since the last meeting. Largely, this is going to reflect things that were kind of paused due to winter. We generally clear very few camps during the winter, knowing the struggle that inclement weather has on individuals finding somewhere safe to stay. So a lot of these were camps that had been inactive or abandoned for some time that were kind of just catching up on the cleaning. So the first location was at the Man of War Boulevard, Nicholasville Road Bridge. This is a designated emphasis area. We initially received report of activity by police on December 16th of 24. We received an additional account from a council member about a second camp in the area on February 25th. There are numerous attempts from street outreach indicated here starting on December 17th, December 23rd, December 26th, with no contact made and no signs of an active encampment except for on December 23rd. Those individuals, I believe, had contact with a worker in the area and expressed intent to relocate. They were still there on the 26th, and services were declined, again expressing intent to relocate. By December 31st, there was no signs of active encampment. It does look like the individuals relocated. Attempts carried forward into early January. And then prior to cleanup being scheduled, we had the team go back out due to the additional report. There were no signs of active encampment on February 26th. As an emphasis area, posting is not required for this. And since there was no signs of active encampment, we did not move forward with notice. On March 4th, that camp was removed at a cost of $2,705.12. Location number 2 was at DeRoge Street, High Street Bridge, another emphasis area. OHPI was notified by police on February 13th. On February 14th, outreach made an initial attempt at contact. No contacts were made. They did have contact on February 25th with 2 individuals. Both declined services and expressed intent to relocate. As of March 6th, there were no contacts made, no signs of active encampment. Checked again March 7th, same outcome. With no active encampment and as an emphasis area, there was no notice posted. The camp was removed on March 12th at a cost of $637.60. Location number 3 was at Oxford Circle, Versailles Road. This was originally notified to the OHPI on January 20th of 25 by a private citizen. Outreach made an attempt on January 27th, and 1 individual was reached. Services and shelter were declined. We tried assertively for several weeks to engage this individual due to inclement weather, but he did refuse shelter. There was actually a chimney and fireplace built inside this structure, so I guess he was warm enough that he did not want to come in. We continued those attempts February 3rd, February 13th, February 14th, all with the same outcome. On February 14th, he expressed that he was going to be going to a treatment center. On February 24th, no contact was made, but there was still an active encampment. February 25th, again had contact, services declined. And then attempt was made on March 4th. No contact was made. Did not appear that the individual was there. We confirmed the individual was at Fayette County Detention Center on an unrelated charge and not expected to be released until January of 26. So they went ahead and moved forward with cleanup on March 12th following a initial notice on February 3rd and a final notice on February 24th. removal of that camp was at $737.60. This also ties in with what's listed as location 5 on your packet. That was a very close by camp where, when he had expressed relocating, he did end up taking his structure and moving it down the street. We were notified of that location on February 3rd. There was, I think, 2 individuals, and we had a contact on March 21st with 1 individual, that would be the individual from location 3, appearing over here on March 21st. Again, services and shelter declined with intent to, again, enter a treatment program. Then first notice was posted on March 21st, final notice on March 24th, cleaned and removed on March 28th at a cost of $597.87. Location number 4 was at Man of War Boulevard, Sarin Drive, another emphasis area. We were notified by police on March 4th. 1 contact was made with 1 individual on that date. He was transported to the Empath Center. On March 5th, Street Outreach had a follow-up contact at Empath, and the individual was transported to Winter Shelter. On March 10th, individual was contacted at this location, another individual that had moved in. He declined services, was informed of the emphasis area designation, and expressed intent to relocate. Additional contacts were made on March 18th and March 24th with no signs of an active encampment. With no active encampment and as a designated emphasis area, there was no posting. That camp was cleared on March 25th at a cost of $1,164.90. The final location is quite a doozy. This was in the Loudon Avenue Bridge area, and it involved public property, private property, and railroad property. Notice of activity was given to OHPI by code enforcement on March 11th. 2 individuals were contacted by Street Outreach on that date. Both declined services and expressed intent to relocate. On March 12th, there were 3 individuals contacted. They were notified that the private property owner was moving ahead with cleanup. We wanted to make sure that they were aware of that so that they could relocate if they chose to. Services were declined. 1 additional individual was contacted at another area of this large encampment on March 12th, and also declined shelter, but did accept some basic needs item and notified him of the pending cleanup. Attempts were made on March 13th and March 14th with no contacts actually made. 1 additional individual contacted on March 17th. Services and shelter declined. March 21st, contact was made with 2 individuals. Services declined, expressed awareness of the cleanup and that they were going to relocate voluntarily. March 31st, ahead of cleaning, we had outreach go back out. There were no signs of active encampment at that time on all 3 of the involved properties. Initial notice had been posted on March 14th with final notice given on March 21st. Cleanup did not occur until April 2nd. This one took some additional planning amongst my office, code enforcement, environmental services, and waste management to try to figure out the most effective way to do this and keep the cost as low as possible. Ultimately, though, it still ended up being a cost of $21,544.02. That's probably our most expensive camp cleanup for this fiscal year for sure, possibly since I've been in my role. So that's going to change a little bit in terms of our summary numbers. For this period, we did, again, clear 6 different camps on 6 unique locations. Total cost for this period was $27,387.11. Since this large cleanup would skew the average, I've given you both an average and a median cost. The average cost was $4,564.82. But if we do a median, that is $951.25. There was contacts made at all the 6 locations. 3 of them involved emphasis areas. There were a total of 11 persons contacted, only 1 engaged in services, with 10 declining and relocating. To give the summary for fiscal year 25 so far, we are up to 17 unique locations with 20 camps that have been cleaned. Total cost of $64,222.11. Average cleanup cost of $3,211.11, with a median cost per cleanup of $1,322.45. That makes 10 camps total so far where no contacts were made and there were no signs of active encampment. For emphasis areas, we had 5 unique emphasis areas this fiscal year that have been cleared with 8 cleanups. And then 10 locations where contacts have been made, a total of 22 persons contacted, 3 engaging in services, and 19 declining and relocating. A few notes on this. One being at the last meeting, Councilmember Sheehan had requested, due to another large cleanup that had cost around $19,000, that we try to calculate the average cost per cleanup without that outlier amount. Since we now have another one, what I have done is start doing average and median to kind of give a better sense of what the typical cleanup cost would be without those outliers. Additionally, as of May 2025, this month's report, Environmental Services has begun giving me the cost of dump tickets associated with the trash and debris that's collected. This information was not previously tracked or provided to me, so this may kind of cause some shifts in terms of the dollar amounts that we see. Final note would be that we are seeing larger camps with a higher dollar amount to clean, and unfortunately seeing a high amount of persons that are declining services. My office requested in the upcoming fiscal year a new position to serve as an encampment coordinator, to be somebody in our office that can go out into the field directly, spend a little bit more time working with individuals, following up with outreach on service plans, trying to usher people to better solutions that are a little bit more permanent and result in encampments not returning and not escalating to this level. That was included in the mayor's proposed budget. We still have to have that officially approved by council, but the outlook is good that the staff is going to increase in the Office of Homelessness, and we'll have somebody that can spend a little bit more time in this specific area. They would be someone within the office that would have a high level of knowledge about the resources that we can facilitate, and really help guide that process. Any questions about the encampment report? I know it was lengthy this time. Largely, yes. Like that Loudon Bridge one, I can't remember how many tires that it had, but it was a very large number of tires, and those usually cost us extra in terms of disposal. And then the level of equipment that needed to be brung in, they had to do a lot of staging with that, where they pulled things down that were closer to the road, and pulled it all down, staged it so that it could then be picked up, put in containers, and hauled off. So it was just more complex in terms of some of the steps that needed to be taken and some of the machinery to be used, in addition to just a high volume. There were hundreds of bags of trash, pallets, just a lot of items that made it more costly. And then we are seeing some pretty elaborate structures. The one on Oxford Circle didn't end up taking as much money as we expected to clear initially, but we're seeing things that are a little bit more permanent in nature, and just take a little bit more of the contractor's time. Yeah. I've seen fireplaces, swimming pools, mounted TVs. So definitely we are seeing things that are a little bit more complex. Yeah.
had a question.
Yeah.
So in terms of, I know that we have a running kind of budget that we've utilized. Do we have an idea of like, I guess the remainder of the fiscal year? Do we have only so much left, or is it a line item, or is it just part of a general fund?
So
Couldn't
none
remember.
of the actual funds to clean encampments come from this office or the Innovative and Sustainable Solutions budget. It would be within the budget of the entity that's responsible for clearing. So for most publicly controlled property, that would go through environmental services, and they would have a budget in the general fund for that. Code enforcement sometimes assists with abatements on public property where there might be something like a non-responsive owner. And then parks would also do cleanups, largely facilitated by their staff. So all of those divisions would potentially have some budgeted funds for this purpose.
Okay, thank you.
And that was probably what led to the kind of multi-division effort for the Loudon Avenue Bridge. If we had not approached it that way, the cost probably would have been closer to something like $40,000, and would have pretty much exhausted the fiscal year budget that environmental services had. So we were looking for strategies. Code was able to chip in a little bit on that by waste management directly handling some of the work that reduced costs greatly. But that is a significant factor that we also have to consider, is we don't really have a good way of estimating how many camps we're going to encounter, how much they might cost to clear. And that's one of the arguments that I used for advocating for an additional position was we really need better mechanisms to address this so that we are not exhausting this much funding when inversely it could be used to do things like permanently house people. I guess I don't need to turn this off because I'm next. All right, we are going to have a visual for this one just to kind of make it a little bit more engaging than just listening to me speak. As Joy had mentioned in her report out from the Data and Systems Integration Committee, at the time of that meeting, we did not have any kind of guidance as to when we would be submitting our point-in-time count and housing inventory count. That has now been established for June 13th. This office worked to go ahead and finalize our numbers prior to the establishment of a deadline. We wanted to make sure, in addition to being able to get this information to our board membership and the community, we were also trying to ensure that we had current information that was included in our shelter feasibility study. So there is a Lex count report in your packet also being projected here on the screen. This year's count took place on the evening of January 29th, typically falling within the last 10 days of January. And we have some longitudinal information about the results of the Lex count. At an overview level, this year we had 925 persons that were residing in emergency shelter, transitional housing dedicated to persons experiencing homelessness or unsheltered locations. That's going to be a 100 person or 12.1% increase from 2024. Some things that kind of contextualize that higher number. We had more persons residing in an emergency shelter with 810 persons than any previous Lex count. This office has been conducting the Lex count since 2015, with previous counts conducted by Central Kentucky Housing and Homeless Initiative back to the early 2000s. Transitional housing bed utilization was up significantly. Last year, we saw a really low utilization amongst those programs, primarily in our system, veteran transitional housing beds, which was a national trend. This year, that utilization was up nearly 21%, and the utilization sat at 82%, which was actually sat at 79%, which was the highest since 2020. The number of unsheltered persons this year decreased by 15. We had 82 that were identified in the 2024 count. So that is an 18.3% decrease from the previous year, probably coinciding with the fact that there were a significant amount more persons in shelter. In addition to kind of those high-level overview numbers, we like to also give you some trends that we're seeing amongst certain populations. So we saw the largest rate of increase among households with children. In 2024, we had 45 households with children, representing 164 persons. That nearly doubled this year to 77 households and 230 persons in households with children. That's going to be a significant percentage change, whether we look at the households or the number of persons, somewhere between 40% more persons, 71% more households. Additionally, persons and households with children made up about a quarter of all persons included in this year's Lex count, up from about 20% last year. Finally, we also saw an increase in the number of youth aged 18 to 24. That was at its highest since 2015, increasing about 31% from the previous year. In terms of chronic homelessness, we did see a slight increase. However, it's relative to the fact that we had 100 more persons accounted for in this year's count. It was 19.5% of all persons in this year's count reporting that they were experiencing chronic homelessness, compared to 20% over the past 5 years. This is still slightly below the national average of about 30% of persons experiencing homelessness experiencing chronic homelessness. This tells us a couple of things. One, as we've discussed previously, we need to continue prioritizing expansion of permanent supportive housing beds that are ideal for meeting the complex needs of this population. But additionally, we need to look at diversifying the type and level of housing supports that are available. This way, we can do things like identify households that need less intensive supports and more rapidly exit them from homelessness, and avoid them experiencing lengthy wait times for resources through the coordinated entry system. We mentioned an increase in youth 18 to 24. Overall, youth 18 to 24 made up about 8% of persons experiencing homelessness in Fayette County. And only 44 of the overall 72 individuals 18 to 24 were unaccompanied. That was actually a decrease from 2024. So we had more persons within that age group, but they tended to be a part of households with adults. We had 4 youth, 18 to 24, that were unsheltered, and homelessness amongst this youth population has increased each year since 2020. In terms of veterans experiencing homelessness, they compose about 8.2% of the homeless population in Fayette County on any given night. That's right around the national average. There were 0 veteran families identified. All were adult-only households. 3 veterans were identified as unsheltered. 26 were in emergency shelter, and 48 veterans were in transitional housing. The COC previously received a designation for having effectively ended veteran homelessness. Even with this slight increase over last year, we continue to maintain that designation because we have a variety of options that are able to quickly and permanently rehouse individuals with a variety of different levels and types of housing. And it's similar to the levels of veteran homelessness that we saw when we received that designation in 2019. Probably one of the more important highlights of this report, and tying into the upcoming shelter feasibility study, is our annual examination of our capacity. Each year, we take a look at the number of emergency shelter and transitional housing beds that are available within our system and map it against the number of persons that were identified in the year's count. So the gap between the number of year-round beds versus seasonal beds is growing each year. We're making that annual $2 million approximate investment in winter shelter that serves a vital need of keeping people safe during inclement weather, but we are seeing that we need more and more of it to get through the season. Additionally, there's some concerning data about our actual year-round capacity. If we remove the seasonal shelter beds, the number of persons that were residing in shelter and transitional housing would have been approximately 122.4% utilization rate. That includes overflow beds, not just year-round beds. Overflow beds are things like cots and mats that shelters keep on hand that are not intended to necessarily be used every night, but are used only on an as-needed basis. What this tells us is if we saw the levels of homelessness throughout the entire year that we did during the Lex count, we'd be operating at nearly 125% of our capacity. Not only is that not ideal, but it's also going to have the effect of being a barrier for people entering shelter. For example, persons with a mental illness that have difficulties being around a high number of people, a large amount of activity, that decreases their likelihood to access shelter. Utilization of emergency shelter and transitional housing beds is also increasing year over year. This year, we were utilizing 89.4% of all beds, including seasonal beds. Finally, with our unsheltered individuals, while we did see a decrease from the previous year of about 18%, it still remains above the average of 38 persons from the previous 10-year period. I think we always need to be careful with year-to-year comparisons because sometimes there can be an outlier that might not be indicative of like a long-term pattern. But this shows that we are year over year continuing to see increases in this population. The majority of persons who were unsheltered, 49.3%, reported that they were experiencing homelessness for the first time. This is similar to last year, with 50% of those individuals reporting that they were experiencing homelessness for the first time. And just a note here that the number of shelter beds alone does not guarantee that individuals can access shelter. We are currently seeing that our shelter system is still largely based on things like gender and household composition. If someone doesn't fit squarely into those populations, it's going to create barriers for their access. An example being 29.9% of unsheltered persons were a part of multi-person households. Knowing, for example, that we don't have a shelter that can accommodate couples without minor children, or sometimes mixed household compositions where we're seeing adult children, we don't always have shelters that will accept them. So even though we are seeing that our seasonal capacity was high enough to theoretically shelter everyone, that's why there's still a gap and still persons that are going unsheltered. There was a note here that at the time that we produced this report, we had not yet gotten guidance on the official submission to HUD, and so it was a possibility that some of these numbers could change. There are validations alerters built into the platform that we enter into. I've done a preliminary input of all that information and have confirmed that their data validations did not identify anything additional. These numbers should be our final numbers. With that in mind, we are going to want to go ahead and get a vote on this item from the board so that we can complete that submission in June. I'll pause here and let you vote so I can have a break. Is there a motion from the board to approve the results? Thank you, Bruce. Is there a second?
Second.
I heard multiple seconds, so I'm going to go with Billy. I heard her voice. All right. Any further discussion before we vote? All board members in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes. All right, next, our budget update. So for the budget update, this is shrinking a little bit because we've now exhausted almost, I believe, all of our ARPA funding. So we will no longer be reporting on multiple years of ARPA funding that replaced innovative and sustainable solutions funding. The only program still operating on 24 ARPA funds, we are still in the process of closing out expenses for the winter family shelter with Community Action Council. We expect that final invoice any day to be able to close that out, and then we'll be completely done with our ARPA funds. In terms of our fiscal year 24 funding, we had received an additional $750,000 at the end of fiscal year 24 to go ahead and make the increase taking effect in fiscal year 25 effective immediately. So we still have some programs that are operating off of that funding and we have a unallocated balance of about $744,057. Current programs on this funding include the Intensive Case Management Program with Independence Place and the Landlord Partnership Program with the Housing Authority, as well as the Shelter and Feasibility Study. For fiscal year 25 funds, we received $1.4 million in fiscal year 25. We recently closed several RFPs that have been approved by council and gone under contract. That includes Arbor Youth Services and Community Action Council operating our Housing Flex Fund. We're in the process with just 2 agencies that volunteered to operate that fund. We're just working on making sure that there is a mechanism for application or referral that doesn't overwhelm those 2 agencies and effectively gets the money into the hands of the individuals that need it. We also had 4 agencies that responded to an open RFP for program funding under $40,000 to address service gaps. The Lighthouse Ministries is going to be doing some improvements to increase the number of offices at their Clean Start program that service providers deliver on-site services as a one-stop shop. They're also going to be able to create additional storage and a bathroom for clients in that space. Greenhouse 17 is going to receive funding to be applied to their farm stipend program. That's going to allow survivors to effectively earn money that can be used towards housing expenses to leave shelter. Community Action Council is receiving funding to be able to provide services to those on the wait list for emergency family housing or to provide follow-up aftercare services. And Arbor Youth Services is receiving funding to essentially expand the operations of their outreach center to 24/7. That leaves us with about $147,526 remaining unallocated from fiscal year 25. We also have the winter response funds that are down at the bottom of this table. Those are technically not innovative and sustainable solutions funds. That comes from the general fund. But we are closed out on the majority of our expenses, so we will have some money that's left over from a couple of those purchase orders, which could be rolled into next year's response or other purposes. We currently have about $84,000 remaining from that winter response. Any questions regarding the budget update? All right. Next, we are going to switch gears and we are going to talk more in depth about that winter response. So we've prepared a presentation that's going to take into account 3 different strategies that we operated this year. You can go to the next slide. So we have the LFUCG Winter Shelter Program. We did not have an agency that was the direct operator of that program. So this office oversaw it and partnered with supportive service providers to deliver services to participants. That was able to accommodate up to 190 persons in a motel-based shelter, carrying 95 rooms for the season from from November 1st through April 1st. That was the time frame for all 3 of these programs. We also gave additional funding to Community Action Council and their emergency family housing program to be able to facilitate hotel stays for families. That was originally projected at 3 rooms. We'll give a note on that. And then Winter Medical Respite Program operated by Bluegrass Care Navigators. We do have a year-round medical respite program, which is typically shorter stays, an average of about 2 weeks. This program was intended for persons that are elderly and disabled and have barriers to accessing other forms of shelter. They carried 10 rooms for the season. Next slide. Right. So first, with the main shelter program that accommodated the majority of persons served by Winter Resources, we partnered with 8 different agencies to deliver services. That was Arbor Youth Services, AVOL Kentucky, Catholic Action Center, Community Action Council, Greenhouse 17, Hope Center, Lexington Rescue Mission, and New Beginnings. The overall budget for this project was $1.9 million. Roughly based on that original budget, the cost per person, based on 322 persons being served, is almost $6,000 per person for the season. Average length of stay on this model was 71 days, and we came in just under the original budget at $1,845,000. Next slide. So of the 322 persons that were served throughout the season, 61 of them obtained permanent housing. That's about 20% nearly of persons that were served throughout the season. This includes a number of participants who actually moved into housing just after April 1st with financial assistance operated by the Office of Homelessness. To give some context, across our congregate shelters that participate in HMIS, they would have had closer to about a 9 to 10% permanent housing exit rate. So I definitely want to acknowledge the work of our supportive service providers, because despite all the challenges and all the flaws that we see with the model and approach, there were some good housing outcomes that came from their work. So thank you to each of those 8 agencies for their participation. Some other notes, we, again, have kind of gone through several different models of winter shelter response. We've done things like motels that are available only during inclement weather. We've done season-long hotel. We've done season-long site-based shelter like last year's Hope Village. There's some interesting comparisons between them. So last year, the Hope Village, which was of a similar cost, actually served over 1,000 unique persons throughout the entire season, whereas this year we served only 322 persons. The length of stay was also significantly different. What we saw with the Hope Village kind of model is that people tended to access it on an emergent basis, typically when the weather shifted and became more inclement. And they had several instances of stays with a shorter average, about 5 days at a time. This year, we had continuous stays averaging 63 days for those that were in the program. So this leads to some considerations as we plan for next year and beyond. One is, with this model, there's a significant limitation on the number of persons that can be served. For example, we had a finite number of rooms that were contracted at the beginning of the season, and we did not have an opportunity to operate overflow. Over the course of the season, we did give funds to Catholic Action Center 2 different periods for operating overflow, and we're grateful for their assistance. But we have to acknowledge, if this is our model, we're always going to have some kind of a plan for overflow when the weather shifts and increases the need beyond our projected capacity. That also means that this investment that we're making of nearly $2 million each year on this model is going to serve a significantly lower number of persons, making that a much higher cost per person. For 5 months, my office, which is not a direct service office, became a shelter operator and coordinator. That produces significant strain on us as a 3-person staff, but also to our provider agencies. They did not receive funding that allowed them to essentially hire additional staff positions. And so this was, for all of us, kind of straining the capacity that we have and distracting from some of the daily work that we do to help people that are experiencing homelessness. So it's definitely a consideration. Additionally, there's significant sunk costs with this model. One, for really any seasonal approach, unless we were to select one site and use it over and over again, we're going to have sunk costs such as site setup, or in the case of a hotel program like this, we don't have any kind of actual items towards a future shelter that we can apply. It's just gone. Additionally, there were extensive damages to both hotels. Collectively, throughout the season, for both of the hotels utilized. That was about $84,000 worth of damages. That's a significant amount that could be used towards other programming. Finally, this is a high barrier model. When we have this kind of approach, it's not a drop-in shelter. You can't just report to the hotel and be guaranteed a bed that night. You have to go through an application and referral process. Additionally, we had a high number of participants that did not succeed in hotel. When the private property owner is not a homeless service provider, they're going to have less tolerance for certain behaviors. And oftentimes what this model is trying to do is trying to expand shelter options for persons that have barriers to other shelter or restrictions from other shelter. So we have to acknowledge that this population is going to have some kind of behavioral, pragmatic issues that are going to need to be addressed. And this isn't the ideal approach for that. Even where we had 2 hotels, they were in close proximity, and we find that the hotel owners know each other. And so sometimes an issue on one property, we didn't always have the ability to just house that person at the other property. So essentially, once they burn through that one opportunity, their need is still going to exist, but we have no more option of where they can be placed. So next, we're going to talk about the 2 other programs that we had, starting with Community Action Council's Winter Shelter Program for families. This was originally budgeted to accommodate approximately 35 families with about 30 nights of shelter, and that would be approximately 3 rooms maintained throughout the season. What Marty could tell you is we saw a lot higher demand for this program than what was originally proposed. They oftentimes had 10 or more families in hotel at any given time. Ultimately, they served 41 households with 148 persons, average length of stay being 43 days. So that would mean that they not only served more households than projected, but they served them for a longer period of time. The initial budget for that project was just over $122,000, ultimately increased to $177,804. Based on that total budget, it's about $4,336 per household, or a little over $1,200 per person served. We're still in the process of finalizing all expenses for that program. We'll make sure that gets into this report when it's finalized. Next slide. Of the 41 families served in this program, 25 families ultimately moved into permanent housing. 14 of those families exited to permanent housing on or before April 1st, which was about 34% of those served. 8 families were then transitioned to the year-round emergency family housing program. Of those 8, 3 have moved into permanent housing, and 1 is awaiting the availability of an assisted unit. And then 8 additional families since April 1st have moved into housing with financial assistance from this office, which was about 20%. And again, makes an overall total of 25 of 41 families moving to permanent housing. On that, I just want to say that Francia Gonzalez, the case manager for this program, did amazing, amazing work in moving the majority of her families into housing with a very short time frame. She very much knew the needs of her families, worked hard and assertively to identify units, and made great use of available financial assistance. So thank you to Community Action Council that those 25 families did not end the winter homeless. So we definitely need to consider a couple of things. One would be that, again, we served more families for a longer length of stay. This is something that is what we're seeing in the project data, but also going back to the Lex count, what we're seeing in our system data is an increased demand amongst families. What Community Action Council reported to us is that the majority of families served were experiencing homelessness due to recent evictions. So we need to, again, continue to look at prevention mechanisms like the Flex Fund and other opportunities. But then we also need to consider looking at future winter responses, how we increase these resources until the time that we have additional permanent year-round family units available. And finally, some notes on the winter medical respite program operated by Bluegrass Care Navigators. This, again, targeted persons with physical disabilities or other significant mobility limits that were unable to access existing shelters, specifically focusing on seniors 62 years of age or older. Program budget was just over $200,000, making the per household cost about $7,445. Final expenses came in around $20,000 under budget, $182,223. They served a total of 27 households and 35 persons, with a note that 2 participants were served in the program twice. Average length of stay within this program was about 48 days. In terms of outcomes, next slide. 19 individuals from this program, 54%, exited to permanent housing. The types of services that they received beyond permanent housing, healthcare referrals were made to programs like hospice, PACE, mental health care, medical equipment, service, SUD, substance use recovery, primary care, and specialty care. And then some of the other services that people were connected to were things like intensive case management. 22 individuals were referred to the intensive case management program with Independence Place. Many were supported with food assistance like God's Pantry referrals or assistance with obtaining SNAP benefits, guardianship, connection to specialized care providers like AVOL, and transportation assistance and assistance in obtaining IDs and birth certificates. Bluegrass Care Navigators also sent us a couple of success stories. We know that sometimes data alone is not going to paint the full picture of our programs. So in January 25, they had a couple partners for over 20 years who had come to the end of their hotel stay with another provider and were referred to Bluegrass Care Navigators Winter Program. They were placed and had groceries delivered same day. They had recently lost their car and savings after being exploited by a relative and were facing not only homelessness but food insecurity. The social workers from this program helped connect them with case management and transportation, ultimately helping them to get vital documents they needed and obtain permanent housing. Less than 3 weeks later, the couple moved into an apartment just in time to welcome home their dog, fostered by the Lexington Humane Society. Bluegrass Care Navigators continue to support the couple even after they left the program, connecting them with the PACE program for ongoing medical and social service needs. They continue to live safely together in their new home. Another success, they had an elderly gentleman who had been homeless for approximately 3 years on the streets, struggling with substance use disorder, alcohol use disorder, and PTSD, referred by family members who were unable to take him in but were concerned about his well-being and him having newly diagnosed health conditions while on the street. He was permanently banned from local shelter and in need of a place to stay. With services available, his family located him and helped transition him to the program. During his time there, he was provided with transportation assistance and assistance with obtaining an ID, began receiving SSDI benefits as well as SNAP benefits. He was referred to Independence Place for additional help with housing. He's since obtained a housing voucher and moved into permanent housing. His family has been in contact with Bluegrass Care Navigators since the program, mentioning that he continues to maintain his sobriety and live independently. He recently received a car purchased for him by his family, and he's expressed that he is doing well and has plans to spend even more time with his family. And a final success story from them, they had a patient who was experiencing homelessness with worsening health conditions, including oxygen dependency, and the level of care was preventing that individual from continuing to stay at existing shelters. They were returning to emergency rooms on a near weekly basis prior to entry to the program. After being admitted, transportation was arranged to assure attendance with medical appointments. And assistance was rendered with obtaining medical equipment, with nursing visits and education that got adherence to the treatment plan and saw a significant drop in the number of ER visits, which are now very infrequent. The patient was referred to Independence Place and housing was secured with St. James Place. The individual was also connected with the PACE program from Bluegrass Care Navigators, which will begin in just a couple of weeks, where they'll be able to continue to receive care to help them remain in permanent housing with St. James Place. So that was a lot of data and information, but I think it's very important that our board understand what the funds that we dedicate towards winter response do for our system. Unfortunately, I don't always hear support for these programs from the community. There are a number of people who do support them. There are also a number of people who tell me that these are a waste of taxpayer dollars and that we're going to see no return on investment. What this tells me is that we do get a return on investment in keeping people safe and alive, and we get a return on investment in helping people return to permanent housing. But we can't limit that to seasonal shelter. We need to establish additional year-round shelter, and I need your help with that. So definitely want to open this up if you guys have additional questions, any board members that would like to know more about any of the data presented here.
I don't know if you can answer this, but with the shelter study coming out soon and with that information, like how big of a shelter are you thinking that we're looking at to meet the needs in probably 5-10 years down the road?
So that will be specifically addressed in the study. There is a projection for what our population based on current growth is going to look like in about a 5-year period. Right now, again, we are relying heavily on seasonal and overflow beds, and our system really only carries somewhere around 500 year-round beds, which obviously is not enough to meet our need. So we're projecting, in a 5-10 year period, we're probably looking at something like an additional 500 shelter beds. Now, those would be for different populations. So there would be opportunities for us to either establish more than one additional shelter or to do something like a campus style approach that would be able to serve multiple purposes within one location. But there's definitely going to be a recommendation that if we look at just the actual need, we're currently, again, operating about 125% of capacity with overflow included. If we take away that overflow, it's even more significantly overcrowded. So we sorely need these beds.
Jeff, what do you feel like are the biggest selling points or talking points or things as far as it would help make this argument? One of the things I keep thinking about is the unsheltered number and how it went down a little bit, right? But still the trend over time is that it's going up. I mean, I feel like that not having the beds and the number of people unsheltered, there's got to be a correlation there. If you have less beds, there's more people literally on the street. And I just think about all the problems that come from that when you have people literally on the streets. I mean, as far as just, lots of different things. Dangerousness, crime, the cost of that, that costs money when people are just these cleanups, that's costing.
Yeah. Definitely, I think to a variety of audiences, unfortunately, sometimes money is kind of what speaks. So one thing would be, I know that we've got a significant amount of research about the cost savings to the community of permanent supportive housing. There's not really a lot of great studies that have managed to capture what those costs are current day. Those were largely based on pre-pandemic cost. But even then, there was a savings of a couple thousand per person that's experiencing homelessness in the first year alone, just because they are not accessing things like emergency shelter, having law enforcement interactions, going to jail, going to the ER, which are much more costly ways of serving people. I think for me, the biggest thing that I can try to get people to understand is that numbers are increasing in terms of housing costs are so high and our vacancy rates are so low, coinciding with things like a lot of Community Action Council's families experiencing recent evictions. More and more people are going to continue to be displaced from housing. The inflow is going to exceed how fast we can get people out of our system and into permanent housing. In terms of outflow, looking at a roughly 5 to 6 year period, the length of time that it takes us to obtain housing for someone, even when they do have a voucher or rental assistance, has increased over 200%. That's because we are seeing a very low vacancy rate. There's a lot more competition for each unit. A landlord doesn't have to necessarily accept a program or an individual experiencing homelessness when they have 100 applicants for a unit. The values are going up higher than what we can pay in rents per federal guidelines for assistance dollars. There is also the fact that those federal assistance programs are at risk. The skinny budget recently released by the Trump administration proposes that we would combine the Emergency Solutions or ESG grant program with HOPWA, which is Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS, along with the COC program. And in combining all those, there would be probably significant cuts to the funding, and they've also proposed that there be a 2-year limit on the amount of assistance that any household or individual can receive. We currently have a large amount of permanent supportive housing beds within our system that have been providing stable housing for individuals for many years, probably more than 2 years for the majority of participants. Now, do we transition people on to other resources when they no longer need that level of care? Absolutely. But what we're going to see is we may not be dealing just with our current population of persons experiencing homelessness, but we may see a number of people displaced from our $2.5 million worth of COC program funding if there are significant cuts. And we're going to see other impacts, like it's not going to be just specifically homeless assistance programs. There's massive cuts that are being proposed for things like Section 8 or housing choice vouchers. The emergency housing voucher program, which was rolled out in 21 as a response to COVID, initially was going to guarantee that persons had access to those vouchers for 10 years. Unfortunately, after the current year, they're out of money. Those vouchers are going away. Those are more households that, if they still require that subsidy, are at risk of homelessness. So for me, it's really about showing that presently we are way over our current shelter capacity with the individuals that are currently experiencing homelessness, but then we also are facing a rate of inflow that significantly exceeds how quickly we can exit persons from our system. It's time to ring the alarm.
Well, and not to mention the fact that people turn 18 every day and they're displaced almost immediately. And those kids, a lot of them, I know this because I used to work at RBU services, come in with severe mental illness and severe drug addiction, and we can't house them permanent supportive until they're on the streets for a year, which exacerbates their illness.
Yes.
And it just makes everything much worse.
The longer people remain homeless, the greater their needs.
The greater their needs, and the greater the cost to the city over a long period of time, because these kids become out of desperation become criminals. They become encampments. They become all these things, and they're so young, and they start off so innocent, and they become, where I work now, New Life Day Center, they become the adults that have been on the streets for. I go through the housing. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I go through the housing intake process, and I go, how many times in the last 3 years have you been housed homeless? And they go, no, I've just been homeless for 5 years. Like, they haven't had any break in their homelessness. So it's very concerning to me that we have this many people that are homeless, and we're spending $2 million a year on a winter shelter when we could be putting that money into a bigger shelter or a more permanent solution than just using it every year to band-aid the situation.
I would say if we looked at roughly a 5-year period, the investment that we're making in winter could probably be nearly half of what it would cost for us to just establish additional shelter. So, any other questions regarding this subject or things that I can share with you that help you advocate?
But
again, I think this will come up with a shelter piece, but even just like listening to you all, the needs of the folks that are on the streets are so unique, whether it's a family or whether it's a kid 18 to 24, or whether it's like, so you had said some point, maybe it could be a campus, or maybe it could be a shelter with different, that kind of had different, supportive services and lower barrier, because it caught my attention in the encampment piece, how many people had been reached out to, but they did not accept the assistance to go somewhere else. And I know you've got the position that's coming open, and I'm curious if that's just a little bit of a handhold need, or is it really the options don't work for me because I don't want to go where I have to separate from my partner, or I don't want to go where I have to separate from my children or my dog, or you know what I mean? Like will the extra position you're bringing in actually help? But I think it will help. But also the shelter that people have an option to doesn't meet the needs of the folks that are needing shelter. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I've been asked the question, like, could I successfully manage without a new shelter, just doing something like establishing the new position that we're trying to do and increasing some of our initiatives for unsheltered homelessness? And my response to that is no, because there are not places that everyone can access to stay, which makes it much more challenging for us to actually consistently be able to work with them and move them towards permanent housing when they relocate every few days, when they don't have a working phone or a way that we can reach them, when we spend days or weeks trying to reconnect. That's time that people remain in a homeless situation. And we have to consider that there are things like House Bill 5 in effect that essentially make it a crime for that person to camp in a public space. But we presently are not able, even in terms of sheer numbers, to guarantee the availability of a shelter bed for all persons. And that doesn't even take into effect other barriers to access. We have a very outdated shelter system that is segregated. Men go here, women go there. Part of the reason that I propose something like a campus style approach is it's not easy even for people who are educated and have experience to navigate the system. And that is because it's so fragmented in that way. So ideally, a campus like this would also have an outreach center or a triage center that would be the place you direct people. You don't have to know which shelter serves women, which shelter serves families, which shelter serves youth or DV survivors. You could direct them to one resource. And even if that's not the ultimate physical location that the individual accesses for some kind of support, it's the access point. It's the improvement of the navigation, which helps everyone. It helps those who are in need greatly because it's a much more confusing and process, and it's much more streamlined. But it also, how many times do those of us that do this work have to say, well, we don't operate that service or we don't serve that population. You have to call this provider. And helping people make those connections, there's a lot of time wasted in that waypoint navigation that could be better handled. The other thing is the persons that have higher needs, things that prevent them from accessing what we kind of have as medium or high barrier shelters. If we have the right supports located on site, it allows us to operate lower barrier shelter effectively, safely for the persons that access it, for the surrounding community, but also it leads to better outcomes. So I think that definitely we would not be able to meet this need through things like staffing or programming alone. It's the whole package that's needed.
Also, like non-binary individuals, where do they go to shelter?
Mhm.
Like I mean, at Arbor, they were lucky to be able to let those kids choose which beds they go into, but like a non-binary kid wouldn't feel comfortable going to the Hope Center or to the Salvation Army. Same thing with a trans woman wouldn't feel all the time comfortable going to the Salvation Army, and they definitely can't go to the Hope Center because they're trans woman. So these individuals end up sleeping on the street most of the time.
Yeah, we do have individuals that would identify as non-binary or trans that are accessing some of our current shelters, but it's not ideal. Oftentimes they're going there as a last resort. And there can be a lot of challenges for them and for the operators of shelter in terms of operating in a way that gives that person dignity and privacy that they might need, making them feel like they're actually somewhere where they're safe. And even though our existing shelters have been very accommodating in handling those situations, we also are in a climate where at a federal level, the protection that guarantees that kind of access is being threatened. So even though right now people are operating in a way that they accept individuals, they would not be bound by federal laws or regulations that force them to comply.
Just to add to that, like we have had trans women, and it is very difficult because they come to our place knowing that they're being, they're having to identify as being male. And there's a whole lot of problems that come along with that, but I think that goes to like the shelter design is woefully out of date when we have like mass dorm style places, and that's the only option. So like when we're trying to make accommodations for, bathrooms and showers and things like that, you have to get really creative. And, our system isn't really designed for that. And, we, look at the numbers, our elderly population is increasing. With that comes a lot of health issues. So we have people who aren't medically able to take care of themselves or have really high needs and have trouble in our existing shelters. We have, of course, our SMI population who don't always do well in shelter. You have also the youth population, as Chris mentioned, that really is uncomfortable in our shelter system in general. And I think we are not doing them a great service because as you mentioned, the longer you stay in the shelter system, the longer you're going to stay in the shelter system. And so we have an 18 or 20-year-old who comes in who we can't really help for a year. And then, we just expect them to kind of move along, but that becomes much more difficult as time moves on. So the whole system's just out of date. We miss out on a whole lot of people. And I, operating a men's shelter, I have no clue how I would operate a co-ed shelter. That would be very complicated, but I think that sort of thing is needed when we're dealing with families, when we're
You
dealing with.
kind of did though.
Well,
last
yeah,
winter.
for sure, yeah. And that talk about learning experience. But yeah, and I think like some combination of all those approaches, but I'd like having the campus idea where you have you're able to handle multiple populations and a lot of different needs. You could accommodate like medical respite type beds. You could accommodate families and children. So, the flexibility to include more people would just be beneficial to the whole system. So, I know that kind of speaks against what we are as a shelter, but I think as a system, that model is just out of date. So
Yeah, and I also have proposed that campus also allows not only just different populations or different types of programming to be offered on site, but we can also do things like develop transitional or even permanent housing on that campus for those that we know they can live independently, but they've gotten used to maybe being in a more congregate environment, or they might need to be in an environment where they do have a little bit of on-site support. And those things can be added over time, and we can provide multiple different layers of interventions for people. If there's not additional questions on winter, we did have one item from winter that we needed to vote on. I wanted to be able to bring you a firm number before I got your approval on this. But we operated similar to last year, financial assistance for winter shelter participants so that at the end of winter, they did not necessarily have to be displaced if they had no other option available. Typically, that's going to be a maximum of about $2,000 per household, covering deposit and initial rent. This year, we served 26 households and 60 persons. And that assistance broke down to 38 adults and 22 children. For a total of $40,614, we were able to house those 26 households and 60 individuals. The average assistance per household was about $1,562. If we break it down to the number of people, it's about $677 per person. So that was actually a very cost-effective way, and it shows that this current investment needs to definitely be restructured into where it's producing more of a permanent solution. But for me to use innovative and sustainable solutions funding to cover this cost, I would need board approval. If not, I can pursue other non-board controlled funds. But if we're able to use these funds, it does allow me to use what minimal general fund budget I have for other purposes. Would there be a motion to approve?
I move to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
I can pick someone from that row. All right. I'm glad to answer any questions or entertain discussion, but if there's no discussion, all those in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? That motion passes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Next meeting is going to be on July 9th here in the third floor conference room of the Phoenix building at 1:30 p.m. Now, and I know it's a long wait, so hopefully people are still awake and paying attention. We are going to have public sharing for issues not on the agenda, so it doesn't have to be something that's on the agenda. This can be anyone in the membership or in the attendance of the meeting. It does not have to be from board members.
Quick one. So my other hat, Domestic Sexual Violence Prevention Coalition, it's a mouthful, DSVPC. We do every year a recognition of people that just work in the community to support survivors of domestic violence. So next Wednesday from 4:30 to 6:30 at the Downtown Arts Center up on the third floor. If you want to, there's a few people that are receiving awards, but it's also just a nice community mingle. So stop by and have a cube of cheese and a glass of wine next Wednesday. Love to have you all come.
Other announcements, questions? Go ahead.
I love what you do here. Your focus is kind of on the bigger picture. But I sit at home and I crochet hats, and last winter we gave away about 60 to a church in Nicholasville and the Jessamine County Homeless Coalition.
Yeah.
And we have the whole year ahead of us. So
we actually conduct the Lex Count, which we reference the results of in January of each year. We did have an organization that did crocheted hats for us one year, and we were able to put those in care packages. When we send our volunteers out into the field, this year we found 67 persons. We have them go out into the field with a couple of backpacks that would have items that would be helpful to a person. Sometimes that's bottled water, snacks, hats, gloves, scarves, hand warmers, toiletries, resource cards, information, anything that we can think of that's useful. So we would definitely be glad if anybody wants to support that effort. Feel free, if you don't have my contact information, to stay behind and make sure you have that. You can also call 311 and they can direct you over to our office.
did I hear you say about 60?
We had 67 persons that were identified. We usually try to compile, I'd say, Marissa, closer to 100 bags each year. But if that's a number that's too large for somebody, we can also try to get something from multiple sources. We had some other items that we got, maybe, 50 of from this organization, 20 from this person, 30 from that person. We can piece it together. But we'd be glad to take your support for sure.
I just want to let everyone know that we are having our annual AIDS walk, and that's going to be this Sunday at 1:00. at the, let's see, Robert Stevens Courthouse. So we would love for you all to join us, and you can get online and register. So we'd love to have you.
Absolutely go out and support. I think all of our agencies right now are a little concerned about the future of their funding, so go support AWOL.
I also just wanted to announce, for those of you who refer to Lexington Rescue Mission, we have moved all of our daytime outreach services into our new building, which is at 535 West 2nd Street, the corner of 2nd and Jefferson, as of April 7th. So we are now operating over there, and we're going to have a grand opening on June 7th at 2 p.m. So anybody that wants to come and see, by all means, you're welcome.
All right. Anybody else? And for anybody that did make comment, if you have flyers, information, or anything you want sent out through our listserv for those various events, I'm glad to share those. If there's no further comments or announcements, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
I knew it was going to be you, Bruce. Thank you. We are adjourned. I'll stick around if anybody needs to talk with us.